Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Kevin Burkham. I'm CEO of U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. We are a farmer-led organization that works to champion U.S. agriculture and raise the voice of farmers and ranchers on key issues impacting the sector. I want to welcome everyone to the second in a series of webinars that USFRA is putting on. This particular webinar is on soil carbon sequestration, which is the second opportunity that was identified in a report that we published late last year. That study was conducted by 26 independent scientists and researchers, a couple of whom are going to be on the session with us today. The study was called Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative. And really the results of that report points to what's possible for U.S. agriculture and really showed the way that it is possible to reduce emissions, increase carbon sequestration, and also improve the profitability outlook for farmers and ranchers. And that last piece is especially critical, especially now. So I mentioned the 5 opportunities. The first was nitrogen fertilizer management. It was the largest potential to have the largest impact. That was the subject of our first webinar, which was held on April 21st. You can find the recording of that webinar on the USFRA website, at our YouTube channel, and also on our Vimeo channel. This particular session, as I mentioned, is on soil carbon management, which we're discussing today. Animal protein production and management is the subject of the third webinar that we'll be having on June 17th. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on today. And then the last 2 opportunities are the crop production and yield gap and the efficient energy use on farm. And they will be the subject of webinars later on this year. So Jamie, if you can put up the agenda slide. We are fortunate to have a very distinguished panel for you this afternoon. Dr. Elizabeth Ellis of Colorado State University, who is one of the authors of the soil carbon sequestration chapter of the report, will provide a summary of the report's key findings. Dr. Keith Paustian, also of Colorado State and a co-author of that chapter, may chime in with additional context and assist with answering questions if needed. In addition to Drs. Ellis and Paustian, other speakers include Dr. Alyssa Cho of Bayer Crop Science. Bayer Crop Science is a longtime supporter of USFRA, and we thank them for that. And Terry Quam, who is a cattle rancher and crop farmer in Lodi, Wisconsin. He is on the board of the Cattlemen's Beef Board, which is the national checkoff for the beef industry, and he recently joined the board of USFRA. Before we get started, we do have just a couple brief housekeeping announcements. The event, as you probably heard, is being recorded. And it will be uploaded to USFRA's homepage, our YouTube channel, Vimeo channel, etc. We do invite you to engage. And so we have the Q&A function enabled. We have the chat function enabled. We'll try to respond. And I ask my fellow panelists to also respond in real time. But we may save some of those also, those comments and questions for the end, where we'll have, I think, plenty of time for Q&A. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Elizabeth Ellis of Colorado State University. Dr. Ellis, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be.
You're muted.
Okay, I clicked it, but it obviously didn't work. Okay. Let's get this in full screen first. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this webinar today. My name is Elizabeth Ellis. I recently received my PhD from Colorado State University, and I still work at Colorado State as a researcher and educator. So yeah, really excited to present some of the findings from this second chapter of the USFRA report. And today I'll be talking about the potential for soil carbon sequestration to contribute to this large goal of making US agriculture greenhouse gas negative. First, let's just go back to basics for a while and talk about how agriculture impacts the carbon cycle in general. Make sure we're all on the same page about this here. Since the dawn of agriculture and land use change have depleted global soil carbon stocks, which releases CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So in native ecosystems, photosynthesis, which takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and decomposition, which releases it into the atmosphere, are largely in balance. So soil carbon stocks remain largely stable. But when we modify ecosystems through agriculture by harvesting and tilling up the land, a lot of that soil carbon, which is contained in soil organic matter, is decomposed and released into the atmosphere. So luckily, we've realized this, and the use of conservation practices have helped us replenish some of the soil carbon that was lost through agriculture and land use change. But there's still a long way to go, and there's a large debt of soil carbon across the globe. So here's where the potential lies. Through increased use of conservation practices and proper land management, we can help replenish some of that carbon that's been lost. So we're really at a decision point here where, yeah, we can continue business as usual, or we can really start to adopt practices that we know increase soil carbon on a large scale. So in addition to CO2, agriculture is responsible for a lot of other greenhouse gas emissions, including nitrous oxide and methane. My chapter isn't necessarily focused on those two greenhouse gases, but I just wanted to call some attention to them as well. So this is what makes up the 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions that come from the US. 10% come from agriculture. So that includes CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. And this also, in addition to just land use change, this includes fertilizer application, management of wetlands, and also all the fossil fuel energy that it takes to manage, harvest, and process crops. So there's really a lot of different areas in which we need to start decreasing greenhouse gas emissions from US agriculture. And where soil carbon sequestration comes into play is that negative emissions potential. So how we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it below ground to hope to offset the greenhouse gas emissions from the sector as a whole. So when we talk about soil carbon sequestration, what exactly do we mean here? Let's first remind ourselves how carbon ends up in the soil in the first place. So CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and it's stored below ground in plant roots and root exudates, in decomposing plant materials and crop residues. Microbes assimilate that carbon and then release it as well as CO2 through decomposition. So the organic matter that's residing in crop systems is continuously cycling between photosynthesis and decomposition. And carbon sequestration can occur when inputs exceed outputs. So in an agricultural context, inputs are anything from plants and crops. So roots and root exudates, crop residues that are left on the field. We can also add carbon into the system from external sources by applying manure, compost, or biochar, which we'll talk a bit about later. And then we can manage carbon outputs. Outputs come in the form of microbial decomposition of organic matter, or managing erosion, which is more of a displacement of carbon from one place to the next, but carbon displacement from where we really want it to be, which is on our croplands. The rate at which soil carbon turns over through that microbial composition is dependent on a lot of factors. The climate in which a field resides, the chemistry of those plant inputs, how active the microbial community is, the soil texture and time. And then, of course, how we manage the soils, how often they're disturbed, and how we are modifying those plant inputs. And then soil carbon is protected by a lot of those factors as well, mostly protected by how accessible that organic matter is to microbes. So whether they have the right enzymes to break it up, if that organic matter is associated with minerals or protected in aggregates. So a useful way to characterize different kinds of organic matter in different pools is we can separate organic matter into particulate organic matter or mineral associated organic matter, which both have differing turnover times in the soil. So the particulate organic matter is what you can kind of see with the naked eye as like plant particles in the soil. It's mostly protected by aggregation, but this fraction is really sensitive to disturbance. So when we modify an ecosystem and convert it into agriculture, this is the first pool of organic matter and organic carbon to be depleted. So it turns over really quickly. While the mineral associated organic matter is where organic matter is bound to mineral particles, and it's much more protected from disturbance and protected from microbial decomposition. So this pool turns over a lot slower. And this is the dominant place that organic matter resides in agricultural soil. Okay, now that we've gone over kind of the basics of soil carbon dynamics and where it's stored in agricultural systems, let's talk about how we can start to increase that amount of soil carbon and start to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in agricultural soils. So we know that systems of agriculture are better suited to do this. Regenerative agriculture is one way we can describe that system of agriculture that decreases the outputs of soil carbon and increases the inputs. And this is accomplished not by prescriptive management that works in every place, but rather by designing systems that adhere to 6 ecological principles. Here is a figure from the report that I created to summarize those 6 principles and how they modify the ecosystem to increase carbon. So the first principle is minimizing soil disturbance, which usually refers to a reduction in tillage. We also want to keep soil covered by eliminating periods of bare fallow and keeping crop residues on the field. Want to increase the diversity of carbon inputs across the system, whether that be, temporal diversity, making sure crops are grown year round, the spatial and biochemical diversity of inputs to the soil. Want to integrate animals back into cropping systems wherever possible. Want to maintain living roots in the system. And then perhaps most importantly, implementing practices within the context of the unique system, knowing that not one practice is going to work in every situation. And we know for each of these principles, the practices that kind of go along with them have differing rates that they may be able to increase soil carbon in the soil carbon, with some increasing soil carbon at faster rates than others. So I'll kind of go through each of these practices now and what we know about their potential to increase soil carbon. The first, no-till and reduced tillage. So doing away with annual cultivation of the soil in favor of leaving things undisturbed and usually maintaining crop residues on the surface as well. So this is an example of reducing soil carbon outputs. By reducing disturbance, we're protecting the existing soil carbon stocks. We know from long-term studies and observations on farmers' fields that no-till tends to increase soil carbon in the topsoil, mostly in like the top 20 centimeters or so, but sometimes it actually reduces carbon in the subsoil. So this can be a bit of a trade-off, and is why it's important to measure soil carbon as deep as possible in the soil profile. So if we know that this mostly helps decrease outputs, we can add in complementary practices that might increase the soil carbon inputs. So integrating no-till with cover crops, residue retention, adding in carbon-rich amendments like compost or biochar. And we also know no-till comes with a lot of co-benefits, like minimizing erosion, increasing water use, water retention, and reducing fossil fuel use. Keeping soil covered. This is making sure there's a mulch, a living mulch or a dead mulch across the field year round. So this can be done through residue retention, cover cropping, mulching, or eliminating periods of bare fallow. We know this also can really help reduce erosion, which is reducing the soil carbon loss or displacement from the system. And it also helps control soil temperature and moisture. So by modifying and keeping more consistent the ecosystem in which those microbes are residing, this can help slow decomposition as well. And then we're also just increasing carbon inputs to the system throughout the year by keeping soil covered. We also want to increase the diversity of carbon inputs. This can be done through diversifying crop rotations, adding diversified soil amendments, such as biochar, compost, or manure. And the idea here is that by increasing the diversity of inputs into the soil system, we're increasing the system complexity, the different molecules that are being introduced to the microbes, and hopefully decreasing decomposition rates that way. And here I'd like to also just call out biochar as an area with significant potential for increasing long-term carbon storage. This is hard biomass that's formed by combusting organic matter at high temperatures and pressures. And applying this to agricultural fields has significant potential to increase carbon storage, but it has yet to really be implemented at scale, but is a really ripe area for future research and implementation. It's also enhanced rock weathering, which would be another example of a carbon input into the system, but I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. Maybe we could talk about it at the end of the webinar. Integrating animals back into cropping systems has shown significant potential to increase soil carbon in both that mineral-associated fraction and the particulate fraction. Increased grazing pressure on plants enhances their growth, particularly below ground, and also manure inputs as a diversified soil carbon input to the system. And then finally, keeping living roots in the soil year round, kind of trying to mimic what perennial grasslands have done for centuries and longer. We know a lot of the biomass of a plant is contained below ground. So anything we can do to increase that root input will significantly increase soil carbon. So that's roots, root exudates, and anything that bolsters microbial activity in the rhizosphere or the area around the roots drives soil carbon increases. There are lots of efforts to develop perennial grain crops, which is a really challenging task, but if we can achieve it, could make a huge difference. Or developing roots with high root biomass, developing crop phenotypes with high root biomass. So in conclusion, with those 6 principles, including context, efforts to increase soil carbon deliver much more than just climate change mitigation. Yeah, we know there's a lot of potential to increase soil carbon to mitigate climate change, but there are so many reasons to implement these practices beyond just climate mitigation. Soil carbon plays an essential role in the soil system in general and will help us develop more resilient agricultural systems with a suite of co-benefits, especially in the face of climate change in the future. Next, I'd like to talk briefly about how we measure, monitor, and estimate changes in soil carbon. Much of what we know about changes in soil carbon that are a result of management changes come from long-term experiments that are managed by universities and research centers across the states and across the world. But we know where these research stations are located are kind of limited spatially, and also the data that come from them are limited temporally. So There's a real need to develop a long-term soil carbon monitoring network across the US. This project, called the Rapid Carbon Assessment, sort of started to take that task on by measuring soil carbon stocks across the US at a number of points. But what we really need to know to quantify soil carbon change as a result of land use change or management change, we need a time series of measurements. Just one point in time only gets us so far. So yeah, if we were able to implement a long-term monitoring system, that would really contribute to our understanding of these practices and also help us increase adoption. This sort of data from long-term monitoring could contribute to a whole system where we can integrate data from remote sensing, integrate data from models, integrate data coming directly from farmers, telling us what they're doing on their fields, to hopefully come up with a way to measure and monitor soil carbon change over time. So I'll talk a little bit about process-based models and how they help us model and measure soil carbon change over time. So process-based models take what's happening in an ecosystem and simulate plant growth and soil processes given the unique site variables in management. So this is a computer model where we give it the inputs of what climate is present in a given agricultural system, the different soil properties, and then whatever management events are occurring on that field. So if a farmer does fall tillage, if they plant cover crops, if they're supplying additional nitrogen, we put that all into the model, and it's able to simulate yields, soil carbon stocks, and greenhouse gas fluxes. So this is a really useful way of modeling soil carbon change over time when we don't have those direct measurements from experiments across the US. And these sort of process-based models help us come up with estimates for soil carbon change across the region. So also in this chapter 2 of the report, we present results from this scenario that we ran where we implemented the most effective practice change for different regions across the US, implementing what would be the most high adoption potential for these practices. So in this scenario, we looked at the change of biomass energy crops from predominantly corn ethanol to more perennial biomass energy crops, changing marginal croplands, perennial plantings, and then adopting regenerative practices like no-till and cover crops and diversified crop rotations. And what you see in this map here are the areas with the highest potential rates for soil carbon increase. All those areas that are green, those have the highest potential rates for CO2 drawdown and soil carbon increase. And you see it's areas that have the greatest potential for change. So that could be converting annual crops to perennial crops, implementing regenerative practices, or any areas that are irrigated have like lots of potential for biomass increase. And then this map here highlights the greatest potentials for total emission drawdown. So these are areas with the highest potential for carbon inputs and reduced carbon outputs. So this is areas with high potential for increase through perennialization, regenerative practice adoption, but then also have periods where the climate changes the climate is cooler in the winter, and then the outputs are decreased. And here's a map just showing what would be the impact of transitioning from corn grain ethanol to perennial biomass crops, such as switchgrass. So in closing, our chapter shows that the potential for soil carbon sequestration is significant across the US, that regenerative agriculture provides a suite of co-benefits in addition to climate mitigation that can help us generate a more resilient agricultural system, and that long-term monitoring helps us create estimates of potential for soil carbon increase across the country and helps us implement this change at a wider scale. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis, and congratulations again on your PhD. That's wonderful news, and thank you for all your hard work on this particular report. A couple of questions have come in. Is it okay if we share your slides with the meeting registrants? Great, because I kind of already promised that, so I was hoping you would say yes. And then you made a point to note the potential benefits of biochar, and we got a question in the Q&A from Eleanor, who was asking about the source. If we were to do it at scale here in the US, what would the source, where would that come from? Would it come from crop residues, or are there other sources that you would say we should look at?
Yeah, I think we'd be careful about using crop residues as a main source for biochar because we don't want to extract too much of that biomass from the agricultural system itself. But cultivating crops specifically for biochar generation, so perennial energy crops like switchgrass, I know can be used as biochar. But I'm not a total expert on where that source might be coming from. So maybe I'll let Dr. Paustian chime in if he has any other ideas.
Welcome.
Hello. Yeah, I've been on. Just real quick. I mean, I think ideal is if there's waste biomass, for example. We had a project a few years ago that was looking at what could be done with a lot of the beetle-killed trees in the Rockies, for example, that were instead being piled into huge piles and burned in the wintertime. And was there a way if you could utilize that material for advanced fuels through pyrolysis, generating biochar? That in principle is something that could be done, but a lot of it boils down to economics. But certainly, if you could use, as Ellie said, either purpose-grown crops that could be, that could also be a bioenergy source as well as yielding biochar as a co-product, or if you have other kinds of, again, waste biomass that can't really be productively used that easily, then that would be a good feedstock for biochar production. I would agree that something like crop residues that have value for both, intrinsically building soil organic matter, but also returning nutrients back to the system, are probably not the ideal source for your biochar.
Got it. That's helpful. Since you were talking, Keith, another question came in about perennials. And Dr. Ellis, you talked a little bit about the potential benefits there, and there was essentially it's a financial question in terms of what farmers and growers have been, raising year after year, the demand, the price, et cetera. How does that play out in terms of what's the return on investment potentially for farmers shifting to more of a perennial approach?
Yeah, I think my answer to that question would be, where are places we can implement perennials already in existing systems? So perennial plantings on the side of croplands, converting marginal lands back to perennials. Where does it make sense economically to transition that system back to more of a native perennial system? Or where are there places where we are growing annual crops for animal feed, where it might actually make more sense to bring animals back onto the land and grow perennial pastures? So yeah, maybe it takes envisioning the system in a slightly different way, but there's plenty of places where they can be implemented.
Yeah, I like the point that you made about not being overly prescriptive, right? Every system is different, every field is different, every region is different. But if we were to look at it, some of the large challenges, the greatest challenges in promoting ag soil carbon sequestration at scale, what would you say some of those are?
I think from my own perspective and my own research, we know that what practices work in what areas, more or less. So we have lots of long-term ag trials that have shown, hey, implementing no-till and cover crops in this region works if you do it in this way. There's some trial and error there and a lot of local knowledge, but sort of the biggest hurdle to overcome are the social social implementation of these practices. So changing how people have managed their land for generations, changing beyond what your grandfather did on their land, or trying to implement change at the social scale, and also just the economics of things. Like cover crop seed doesn't come for free. You're implementing a pretty major change into your system, and if the correct financial support isn't there to make that viable, it makes it really difficult, as well as technical support. So yeah, implementing cover crops for the first time might not come easily. You might want some additional technical support to make that go well right away and make the economics work out. So I think social, technical, and economic challenges are pretty major and are the biggest thing to overcome.
Got it. That's super helpful. Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Thank you, Dr. Paustian. I hope you both can stick around for the Q&A session at the end of the day. But I think we're going to transition now to our next speaker, who is Dr. Alyssa Cho of Bayer Crop Science. Bayer is on the board of USFRA, and Bayer has done a lot of work in this space. And here to tell us more about that and why business should really care and is caring about this particular topic, please welcome Dr. Cho.
Thank you so much. My name is Alyssa Cho, and I am currently the lead for our North America carbon business. And I'll talk a little more about that, but I'm also here as a representative of Bayer. And so what I want to talk about today is kind of the context around why businesses care about carbon sequestration in agricultural systems. Why does Bayer care about this? And kind of what does that mean for the farmer and landowner when it comes to opportunities for new revenue streams on the farm? So I'm based out of my house in St. Louis. I've been with Bayer now for about 4 years. My background is in sustainable cropping systems and really looking at how we scale solutions for farmers and how they can access new revenue streams and really support sustainable ag at scale. So what I want to talk about first is kind of why do we even think about companies when it comes to agricultural-based carbon sequestration? So we just heard a lot about the science behind what does it mean to have carbon sequestration on the farm, what influences, what are some of the systematic changes that we need to make it successful. And I think that's really important context to understand. If we zoom out even farther into why do companies care about this and why is this influencing things like the area that I work in, which is carbon markets, we really need to first understand that companies are making their own commitments to greenhouse gas reductions. And a lot of those are around different frameworks. I'm going to talk first about science-based targets, because this is one way that companies, including Bayer, can make clear, actionable commitments to how they're going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So the reason I share this is to kind of give a snapshot of how companies are making commitments, and anybody can go to the Science Based Targets website and look up different companies and read about their corporate commitments that they've made. And you can see here that there's a significant number of companies that have set these commitments. And as you might imagine, there's many companies in there that are sourcing their raw materials from the farm. So thinking about grains and thinking about animal products or byproducts, these are coming from farms and they're part of those corporate supply chains. Why does that matter? Is because if they've made a commitment as a company to reducing their overall greenhouse gas emissions or getting to a net zero, or even getting to a negative standpoint with carbon emissions, they need to find pathways to do that. So what it means is they need to find sources for their raw materials that are going to meet these greenhouse gas reduction levels that they need to be able to fulfill on this broader commitment. And when I talk about these SBTIs, what I'm also talking about is our own corporate commitments at Bayer. And so when we look at what have we committed to as a company, we've committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% per kilo of crop produced, reducing crop protection impacts on the environment by 30%, improving water use by 25% per kilo of rice produced, and also empowering smallholder farmers. And so these are part of our core commitments that we've made as a company towards sustainability and how we're going to meet that. again, looking at SBTI as one of the examples of ways that we've set our own corporate commitments that we're working towards. So bringing that to our conversation today, and Dr. Ellis spoke to this a little bit, which is around what are the benefits of regen ag? And I've had many conversations with growers who either love or hate the term regen ag. But at the end of the day, a lot of the concepts and pieces of what go into regenerative agriculture have been around for decades. We've called it different things over the years. But I think that what's important to recall are some of those key commitments that were in the report of keeping the soil protected, reducing disturbances, adding more biomass into the system. And at Bayer, we also have this set of components of what we feel and what we believe to be key benefits around regenerative agricultural systems, which include things like yield increase and productivity, enhancing that social and economic well-being, again, focusing on soil health and how we improve it, mitigating and adapting to climate change and more severe weather events, preserving, restoring biodiversity, and conserving water. So our vision, especially within our crop science business, has really been focused around this topic of how we can produce more, restore nature, and really scale regenerative agriculture. So kind of zooming back up again one more time before I go down into what we're doing at Bayer, I want to talk a little bit about carbon markets. And carbon markets now have in agriculture have been around for several years, but I still hear the words of it's the Wild West, it's kind of this unknown space, it's really kind of emerging. But when we zoom back out and kind of ask the question of, well, why is this happening and why is it happening now? I think if you really look at the commitments around the Paris Agreement and international accounting frameworks that have started to come forward, it really allows for a level playing field. So when you think about greenhouse gas emissions, my Amazon delivery that comes to my house today and all of the things that went into getting that package to my door are going to impact our global greenhouse gas accounting, right? So just taking into consideration my own footprint doesn't necessarily mean that I'm taking into consideration how it's going to impact our global greenhouse gas emissions and how those interact together. So that means that these international accounting frameworks mean that we all have a set of standards where we all say this specific set of scientifically proven activities lead to X amount of emissions or CO2 equivalent. So we're all using the same sort of currency. So it's like a currency exchange. So we're all basically paying in US dollars, or in this case, CO2 equivalent, when we're talking about how much we're emitting and how much we're sequestering. So what Dr. Ellis was talking about and understanding how much CO2 is being actually sequestered in an agricultural system can be quantified and measured and then used as part of this accounting framework and against an accounting ledger. So when a company like Bayer makes a commitment and we implement a set of practices within our certain set of growers, we can actually measure and quantify that impact and relate it back to our greenhouse gas commitments that we've made at a corporate level. And so that's really important because before having those, it was almost like, how do you prove and how do you make sure that what I'm doing here in the US is equivalent to something that's happening in Brazil or something that's happening in France? Another important piece, especially for us in the US, is the voluntary carbon markets. So those commitments that I spoke to, especially right now in the US, are voluntary. These are not compliance markets or regulatory markets, meaning the federal government hasn't set forward specific commitments that companies have to meet, and therefore they have to report their emissions or they have to set a specific standard for reduction. And that means that there's a market available for these companies to be able to access projects and programs that can help them to meet their commitments that they've made. So if there's a supply chain partner that's purchasing grain from your farm and they've made a commitment, they are likely investing money in how they can meet their greenhouse gas emission targets because they want to, not because they have to. And that's really important for us to understand and better understand why there's this market currently, especially in the US, around voluntary agricultural-based carbon markets. Another important piece is our federal programs, which this screenshot is from before the renaming of this. But basically, there's been a significant influx of federal dollars in the past 3 years, specifically supporting climate smart practices and specifically around USDA programs that already exist, like EQIP. And it's an opportunity for farmers to really look at this as a market opportunity to if they're considering adopting or expanding the practices that they're doing on their farm that can ultimately lead to carbon sequestration, there are opportunities from both a federal standpoint, but also from the voluntary, private sector to help with specifically with the economic component of the transition difficulties. I also want to echo what Dr. Ellis said, which is that the main driver usually, or the roadblock for farmers in transitioning, is usually the social component. The mindset, the societal pressure within their communities around certain practices that they've had in their systems. But there is also that economic component. And I would say over the last 10 years, this is one of the most unique opportunities for farmers to find new revenue sources to help them with these transitions and expansions on their farm. So those are some of the pieces I think that go into play when you consider, well, why does this market exist today? Why do we care about carbon sequestration on the farm? And what can I do with that as an opportunity for myself if I'm a landowner or a farmer or rancher? So I also want to just share what we're doing from a transparency perspective, because that's part of this is my job, is really about how we can help farmers access these revenue opportunities. And the way that we structure that, and a lot of others in this space have done over the last few years, is by having programs for growers to participate. And essentially what this is doing something different on the farm to basically sequester carbon. So adopting new practices that are going to help sequester carbon in your system, and having the opportunity to generate revenue from those practices. We have a pay-by-practice program. It's $6 per acre per practice. We also have a nitrogen add-on. That's a reduction and nitrification inhibitor program. We have a pretty wide geography spread that are covering most of those areas with those high sequestration potential, like Dr. Ellis was showing on the map earlier. We also have the ability for some historic practice payments, which is a bit of a unique offer in the market today. And we do have a 5-year contract program. And what this is a grower-facing opportunity so that you can participate in this market, again, voluntary market, be able to get some guaranteed payments. And there's also the ability to stack these programs onto federal offers as well. So there is opportunity to kind of leverage your local watershed programs or your USDA types of programs to kind of build out a package that's going to really help you with the short-term and the longer-term transition of these practices on your farm. So I think those are most of my slides, but I can take questions. Yep, that's it. And our program is actually called Foreground by Bayer. So if you're looking for the website, I can post it in the chat, but it's bayerforeground.com.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cho. As I said earlier, Bayer's done a lot of work in this space. I know just last week you held a global meeting. I think people from 14 different countries got together here in Chicago to talk about regenerative agriculture, and a lot of what you discussed was explored at that meeting as well. So your carbon market program, Foreground, has been around, I think, 4 years, give or take. Is that what I saw?
Yes.
What are some of the key learnings from then to now, would you say, that you've learned in the last 4 years?
I think one of the key learnings that I think maybe some people were, had some questions about was the longevity of this. And I think that what we've seen over the last couple of years, particularly, is that this is not just a fad or a short-term thing that the market is interested in. These are commitments that companies have made and that they're gonna keep. Especially right now, we've seen a pretty strong signaling of commitment to this. And I think that's important for farmers to understand, that this money isn't just going to disappear, and that these programs and the interest in understanding the sequestration potential and other co-benefits on your farm are not something that is going to disappear. It's something that I would encourage everybody to learn more about, better understand what the opportunities are, and how you can be prepared to participate in it if and when you're ready.
I think that's really helpful. What do you say to some of the critics would argue that estimates have been somewhat overstated in terms of the potential benefits of soil carbon sequestration? They call for more research, more study on that. How would you respond to them? And do we see this as continuing to be a really important practice that more agriculture should really lean into?
I think, I have a PhD in agronomy, and I think science is always evolving, right? We're never at a state of we understand everything. And especially in complex systems where you're dealing with, the environment, soils, water, plants, genetics, a lot of different factors. We're never going to know exactly and precisely everything. There's always something to learn and always something to improve. But I think what's important about these systems is that from the research that has been done over decades, we do know the benefits of improving the soil health through increased biomass diversity, rotations, reducing erosion. Some of the pieces that Dr. Ellis spoke to, that's well known in science at this point. And so I think what's important, especially when we think about developing a program where you're trying to meet that standard of international accounting, is really what is good enough for us to move in this space. And I think that's why these carbon markets have evolved, because we know enough about carbon sequestration to have confidence in the data that we're collecting, the evidence we're collecting, and the true ups that we're doing, to ensure that we're helping us move in the right direction, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. We've got one question from the audience in terms of, are there any plans to expand the BEAR program to additional states? I know you listed a number of states there that you're currently operating foreground in. Are there any plans for expansion?
It's a great question. We are always looking at how we can expand our program offering to include more growers. And part of that includes states, crops, practice year adoption. So we will continue to evaluate that. We usually do a new program each year. So the next time we would have a new issuance would be 2026.
Good. Thank you. Very helpful. Really appreciate those insights, Dr. Schell. We're going to move on to our next speaker at this time. Our final speaker is Terry Quam. Terry is an Angus cattle rancher and crop farmer in Lodi, Wisconsin. He is also Secretary Treasurer of Cattlemen's Beef Board, and he recently joined the board of directors at USFRA. Terry is going to talk about his family farming and ranching operation and how practices on his family farm that his family has adopted are impacting soil health. So Terry, please tell us more about your operation.
Welcome, everyone. Again, you're going to have to excuse me. I'm just an average farmer from Lodi, Wisconsin. I'm not the polished speaker that you've seen before me, but I will do my best. Again, here we run two operations now in Lodi. We run Marde Angus Farm LLC, which is our Angus operation, and the traditional Quam family farm. It is the Quam family farm. I am the fourth generation cattleman and farmer here in Lodi. My son that is home with us full time is the fifth. I have two other offspring, a son and a daughter, that are here part-time with us every night and every weekend working because they have interests in the farm. But we also just added Miller Farm Shorthorns to our operation, which happens to be my mother's family farm. And the Angus cattle we trace back to 1942 is when my grandfather bought two animals for his son and daughter to show in 4-H. He bought two Angus for one and two Herefords for another. And the Angus cattle stuck around, the Herefords did not. I can't tell you why he chose to keep the Angus over the Herefords. I have my opinions, but I won't speak about them today. The Shorthorn operation, Miller Farm Shorthorns, that is my mother's family farm, 3.5 miles to the west of us. And it is one of the oldest Shorthorn herds in the state of Wisconsin. We can trace Shorthorns back to 1908 on that farm. And due to family issues, it was either going to be disbanded or someone had to take it over. And my family voted to take it over. So now, and we wanted to keep the Miller name, the heritage there. We're big in family in this operation. So we now run two operations, Marde Angus Farm and Miller Farm Shorthorns. So if you look at this operation, we've gone through many, many changes, just like any business does. Because what you have to realize, farming is a business, and that's a hard thing for farmers to understand. When my father and I were farming, I went to high school, went on to University of Wisconsin for 4 years and got my degree in animal science and business minor. Came home to the family farm. At that time, my father was a cattle feeder. We had the cows. We only had 60 cows at that time, but we were feeding about 600 head of steers. Most of them steers came out of the state of Montana and were fed here, killed here in packing plants, or processed in packing plants here in Wisconsin. And we were a small grain operation, small cow-calf operation, but we fed a fair amount of steers for that time back in the late 70s and early 80s. But as business transpires and things happen, you have a sudden death of your father, you have your mother end up in the hospital right during spring planting, and then your wife ends up in the hospital 2 days later with another issue, and I'm strapped with 2 kids, a whole farm of feedlot cattle and cows, and crops to get put in. You have to make changes. You realize that you just can't do it. And so that's when the advent of no-till came into my mind. I'd like to say it was for all the soil reasons, it was for all the health reasons, but no, it was for my health reasons, so I could actually get things done and get things. But what you got to realize, back in the late 70s, early 80s, the no-till equipment wasn't there. We didn't have the true, really good no-till equipment that we have today. So we as farmers ended up building our own planters. And that's what I did. And we built a planter, took a lot of grief from a lot of neighbors. You're going to lose yield. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. And again, you have to look at and stand your ground and look at things as an overall operation. So at that time, we moved 2 different things. We decided, with the passing of my father and the economic times in the cattle industry, we moved away from feeding cattle. My wife and I decided to move more into the cow-calf operation side of things and the purebred Angus side of things. And we're up now to 285 cows, and we hold 2 production sales on the farm. In the fall, we hold a female production sale. In the spring, we hold a bull sale. We also hold 2 bull sales in the state of Montana with other producers, and with the largest bull test in the state of Montana, in the US, the Midland Bull Test. And so there our transition went into, and at that time we started to expand our cropping system. We got up to 1,000 acres of crops. But if you look at how my area is here, we're in a very, very high rent per acre farm district. We're in a very high land value district. We're only 20 miles from Madison, capital of Wisconsin. And demand for land is huge because of encroachment and other things. So you got to look and change your operation. And we're changing our operation dramatically again here in the last 5 years of how we do our cropping system to meet the demands of our cattle operation. And to do that, we're kind of switching away from traditional farming methods of raising a lot of corn, a lot of soybeans, and hay production and what have you. What we're doing is, I have evaluated every farm that we either rent or own on a field by field basis and set yield goals, both on the soybean side and on the corn side. And on the corn side, it's 225 bushels per acre with the current crop prices. If that field cannot produce 225 bushel of corn to get into a profitable cash crop or a break-even cash crop scenario, we're going to change our practices. And that's where the beef cows come in. Because we have those 285 beef cows, we can use a lot of alternative forages. We can do the cover crop systems and make them work extremely well for us, especially back on our corn silage ground. We do a lot of canning crops also. We raise sweet corn for the local canning company. That sweet corn comes off in July to early August. We can go immediately in with a cover crop, such as oats or triticale, and either have a great cover crop to go into the winter and leave onto the soil, or we can turn around, if the conditions are right and the water's right, we can harvest that in late October, early November as a forage feed. But the thing you got to realize, we cut it about 4 to 6 inches high. We leave stubble on the ground, but we've also developed that root mass that our earlier speakers were talking about to hold that soil. We're not leaving it bare. one of the things I've developed here and with my kids is to teach them we never want to leave soil bare for very long. We want that soil always covered. Between the rain, the erosion, the sun, what have you baking on it, we always want something on that soil to help the soil quality, efficiency, and what have you. So today, what we're using on a lot of these marginal grounds is winter wheat, because we can sell the winter wheat as a cash crop. We can turn right around and either feed that straw that we get behind the combine, or we can use it as bedding. And we've changed our bedding cycle of what we use, because we do calve 130 cows in November and January here. So we use a fair amount of bedding. We have changed our system of bedding from a lot of corn stalks to a lot more wheat straw. And that wheat straw, again, byproduct of the wheat, cash wheat that we raised, like I said, can either be feed or it can be bedding. And the reason we use it as feed is because we just took off 50 acres of winter rye that we used as cover crop, and we took that off as high protein rye. And we harvested a little bit early, sacrificed a little yield, but we did that on the high protein side. I still have 50 acres of rye to harvest, but we're going to do that opposite. On those soils, they're not as good of fields. I don't want to recrop them. I want to use them as fall crops or a summer cover crop. We're going to take them for yield. We're going to let that rye get a little more mature, take it on volume versus quality. So, I mean, that's my goal on this operation, is to blend cattle and crops together to both increase soil health, maintain the soil in a better condition, and be more profitable as an operation. We do use on this farm a lot of co-products. We feed potatoes. We feed sweet corn byproducts. We only live a mile from the Lodi Canning Company. So guess what? We're very close to deliver sweet corn silage, which we call it sweet corn silage. It's basically the ear that is had the kernels taken off, the husks, and any waste corn. And we can turn that into as good a beef protein as you're ever going to get in the right conditions and using it in the right formulations and the right diets. We also use the ethanol byproducts on our farm to when the price is right. The one thing about the beef industry and the beef cow and the way the beef industry has been structured, she is a very diverse animal. We can change diets quicker and more easily than our counterparts in the dairy industry have. So we can use at different times of the year, when different feeds are available, products that would go to waste normally, we can turn them into high quality protein. And when you look on a national scale of what the beef industry's done, from 1961 to 2019, the US beef industry has reduced emissions per pound of beef by more than 40%. And while producing 67% more beef per animal. What you have to look at today is, if you think back to the last time our largest cow herd was in production, that was back in 1965. We have dropped dramatically from about 35 million cows down to about 27.8, 27.9 is what's projected for this year. But the amazing thing is, we're still producing the exact same amount of pounds of beef out there. You think about that. We've dropped 7, 8 million cows, but we're still producing the same amount of beef. And that gets back to what the US farmer and rancher has adopted over the last 30 years. And even this operation changes. About 15 years ago, we decided to get in and do a little more testing on our cows and our offspring. And so at that time, that's when the Midland bull test came into in Montana. Why did we go to Midland versus all the test stations here in Wisconsin? Because they were doing feed efficiency trials. And what we wanted to find out was how efficient our cattle were. And over the last 15 years, we can prove that we've increased the amount of efficiency in our cattle. And that even though we only send out the bulls, that still transforms back into the female offspring. So we've improved our feed efficiency. We've taken our rate of gains up considerably by identifying and using the animals that have the above average rate of gain, above average feed efficiencies. And another thing that the beef and dairy industry have both adapted on a huge scale are the genomics. When these calves are born, the very first thing they get are some vaccines. They get an ear tag, but they also get a DNA punch. And we take genomics on them cattle immediately. We can tell you within 2 weeks of getting that information back where that animal is going to be placed in our system, whether it's going to go as a purebred bull or whether it's going to go as a replacement heifer, whether it's going to go into our production sale possibly, or whether it's going to go into our freezer beef business. So, I mean, you take the ability to test cattle for feed efficiency, for rate of gain, and the genomics, we've increased the beef industry and being able to produce the same amount of pounds of beef with less amount of cattle. To me, that is key. And one of the greatest things that the beef industry has done for me and the profitability of this farm is be able to merge that cropping system and think about it outside the box. Look at it. Don't worry about what your neighbors are telling you that you got to do or what you should do. Because on the new Shorthorn farm that I bought, there's 15 acres of gorgeous crop ground. And the very first thing they asked me was, are you going to plow that up? Are you going to spray it down? Are you going to get corn on, get them cattle off? No, I'm not going to, because right now the cattle are more profitable than the corn system is. And it gives us options. So with that, that's about what I've got, is that cattle and crops work great together. They make a very unique system for us to produce feed, produce quality protein beef for the consumer.
Wow, Terry, that is impressive. Thank you for sharing that story. There's so many follow-ups I want to ask you. Jamie, while we bring the other panelists back for the Q&A session, I do have a couple things I wanted to ask you about. Each of the speakers today talked about the social barriers to change, and you touched on it a few times, Terry, in terms of what would the neighbors say? What would your dad say? Talk more about that and how farmers are impacted by that, and it does inhibit the willingness to change. Just a local example, here in Chicago where I live, we had a dust storm last Friday. I think it's the first time we've had a dust storm in Chicago since I've lived here for 25 years, and the media reports that it came from fields in downstate Illinois. You talked about, never leave soil bare. So this is kind of a distorted question, but talk a little bit more about social barriers to change, because you obviously have changed significantly in just one generation.
It's tough. I mean, farmers are a tight-knit group, and I was lucky to grow up with a dad being in the purebred cattle business all our life and showing cattle nationally and locally. He taught me early on, look at who's the best. And if you haven't beat the best, you better figure out how to get to be the best. And so many farmers only want to worry about what their neighbor's doing. They want to look similar. They don't want to be different. I don't really care about whether I'm different. If you ask 99% of the people in Lodi, Wisconsin, they don't realize that this year we sold cattle genetics into 19 states and 1 foreign country. They think I just raise beef, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with that because they're not our target market. But I think the hardest thing for farmers to really do is change, and they're scared because their economic viability is based off of what they do. And it is scary. I remember the first time I went out with that no-till planter and what have you. It did not work on all lands. Why? Because I didn't have the equipment. So after that year, we figured out how to make the equipment with a lot of research and a lot of talk. But I think the social pressure of the agricultural community is strong, because guess what? When you think about sustainability, the social aspect is 1/3 of sustainability. Most farmers are on the school board. They're either on the town board, and they know exactly what everybody's doing. I can tell you right now, last Sunday when the water pump went out on my planter tractor and the fan went through the radiator, the neighbors knew it before my people at home did, because they saw the hood up in the track in the field. And so, I mean, social aspect is tough, but I think the younger generation now with social media, I don't care for social media. It's not my thing. My kids are all on it, but I think they're adapting better than the producers my age to it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And you cited some figures in your comments, Terry. I think they probably came from Cattlemen's Beef Board, because we got a question. Great data. Can we get a link to those numbers, please? I'm guessing they're at the Cattlemen's Beef Board website, some of those sustainability figures over time and
Yes.
differences made
You
since.
can get them either off of the Cattlemen's Beef Board, or you can get them off of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, basically through the Federation of State Beef Councils.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Welcome back, speakers. I would like to ask a question, if I could, of Dr. Ellis and Paustian. And Ellie, you talked about measurements and what actions are needed to measure the impact of regenerative practice adoption on U.S. soil carbon stocks. You mentioned that in particular. I know you mentioned the importance of a time series, the ability to track it over time, but can you talk to the challenges about that a bit more, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the largest challenges in our field, and something we have meetings about frequently. It's just like one of those big challenges that is hard to overcome, but we're doing our best to. And yeah, one of the issues is measuring soil carbon is it's a very heterogeneous substance. Like, it's measuring carbon in one place in the field does not account for soil carbon stocks across the entire field. We also want to measure carbon beyond just the surface of the soil and at depth. So taking direct measurements in and of itself is challenging. It requires a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of trained, skilled people. So one of the ways we overcome that is making the most of the measurements we do have to then train models that can estimate and simulate soil carbon, and also developing remote sensing tools that can see what's happening on the ground from the sky and then correlate it with what we know about the direct measurements. So it's really a three-way challenge using all the technologies at our disposal. But yeah, to develop any of those technologies, we need more direct measurements of soil. And we can do some of that on these long-term experiments that are at universities and research stations, but we really just need more measurements in general. So we've been turning to direct measurements from working farmlands, kind of using across the fence comparisons of different farmer systems to add more data to that pool. But yeah, it's a long effort, and we still have a long ways to go.
Absolutely. Nick Miller is asking in the chat, what are some of the best tools for measuring and modeling carbon on the farm?
For measuring, I guess laboratory measurement remains kind of the gold standard. We take samples at various depths and then bring them back to the lab, along with our soil bulk density measurements. Knowing how much carbon content there is only so useful. We need to know kind of the amount of carbon per a given volume. So we also measure bulk density. And there are some more in situ type of tools that are under development to be able to measure soil carbon actually in the field right away. And those technologies are really promising, but not quite able to be used at scale. And then for modeling, perhaps most of interest here would be kind of decision support tools that make our process-based models more accessible. So things like Comet Farm that was developed at CSU by Keith's team kind of makes those process-based models accessible to somebody without modeling skills and helps us make decisions based on those model outcomes.
Thank you. That's helpful. Dr. Shaw, I got a question for you in terms of every farmer, every grower is at a different place in their journey, right? And I think what we all are trying to do is help them accelerate that action. What advice would you give to growers who are in the very early stages in terms of getting started, right? If they're just overwhelmed by the amount of information, and it can be overwhelming and complex, but what advice would you give to those growers?
I mean, I think the best experiences I've heard have been from learning from others. So getting with someone who's already been through the transition and made some mistakes along the way and learning from them directly is probably the best way to find out how you can have a successful transition. Usually the transition part is the hardest part, especially if you're doing cover crops for the first time. It's not really easy. I mean, it takes a lot to understand how to be successful, how to get it to work for your system, and then also how to make sure you're not compromising your cash crop that follows. So I think learning from others is the best way. And then also that you can start small. So we don't always have to go and do everything on our entire operation. We can start on parts of it and have opportunity there. I think reaching out for technical support through your local USDA office or your extension office, if it's still there and supports these types of practices, is another great way to find opportunities to get more information and more knowledge. And then I think patience is also my advice, which is it's going to take time. Anytime we try something new, it's like if I went out and tried a new sport and I was expecting to be in the Olympics the next day, you know, it's not going to happen. You're going to have a transition time and a learning curve. And I think we all need to be patient with ourselves and with others to know that that's going to happen. Again, to Terry's point, though, taking the economic perspective that these are the livelihoods of these farmers, that, you know, you need to take that into consideration too. What's the risk threshold that I'm willing to take this year? And again, what are some ways that I can kind of cushion that risk with other opportunities like USDA Equip and programs like ours that can help kind of buffer that risk?
Mm-hmm. Well said. Terry, at our first webinar last month, we had Dr. Laura Gentry, who's with the Illinois corn growers, and she's also part of Precision Conservation Management. And she likes to talk to her growers and farmers and say, do you know if that farm was profitable for you last year? And you just spoke to how, you know, you have specific goals for the fields that you farm. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that level of sophistication is one, impressive, and two, it speaks to the ROI, right? It's not just about yield, although you did talk about the 225 threshold, but the importance of getting a return on that investment. Can you speak a little bit more to that, please?
Well, I think one of the nice things about what's transpired over my age from starting farming to now is the amount of technology we got out there on the farm. Everybody knows exactly how many acres are in a field now because your corn planter GPS'd it, your sprayer GPS'd it. If you custom hire it done, I can guarantee you those people have all the technology. But on the harvest side, we know most of us have scales on the farm now. Most of us, even if we're hiring it done, the technology and the cabs of this equipment today tell us exactly what our moisture is, what our yields are, everything. We know exactly precision, how we're putting this fertilizer down. We know right to the seed cost, what our population is. So we know we're better equipped with all the economics going into it if you're willing to look at the data and take a look at it. And you got to throw away the coffee shop. Everybody yields 300 bushel corn. Yes, on that field in one spot, we yielded 300 bushel. But you got to look at that field average when you're done with it. And you got to be willing to be honest with yourself. And also, the hardest thing for a farmer to do is to figure out a new system besides the cropping technique. But can I go talk to the dairy farmer or the beef farmer that's next to me and say, hey, if I grow this crop, will you buy it from me? And set up an agreement. We've got to get back to me in this type of agriculture. I work with 2 different dairy farmers on custom work and some things back and forth on genetic side, on my beef side for them, and then some feed supply stuff, what have you. We've got to get back as a farming community, thinking of ourselves as a community and not an individual, in my opinion.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Terry. Appreciate that. A couple questions have come in from Tim for Dr. Ellis. Wondering if you can talk a little bit more about rock weathering and explain what that is. And then also based on the map that you showed, it indicated that the US, Eastern US, has potentially greater opportunity for carbon sequestration. And he's wondering why that is.
Yeah, I'll start with the first question about rock weathering. So yeah, enhanced rock weathering is a method of applying basaltic rock to cropland fields, and then that rock interacts with CO2 in the atmosphere and forms carbonates that kind of pull carbon down in a geologic sense. This is again I'm not exactly like biochar. I think we've done a bit more research on biochar over the years, but another emerging technology that has a lot of potential to really increase stable carbon in the soil, but it has a lot of trade-offs, like transporting and accessing that amount of rock and getting it across the US is a really difficult task, and maybe on a life cycle, not really worth it in terms of carbon mitigation. But it is also shown to maybe help enhance yields and provide nutrients to the soil. So it has some co-benefits, but another just like emerging technology that's pretty popular in research right now. Yeah, and then the map showing the Eastern US as the greatest potential. Yeah, that map showed potential rates based on our assessment of practice change. Yeah, so I think areas like the Mississippi River Basin were highlighted as a really high potential rate of change. And that's based on the potential for practice system change, like adopting more perennial crops in that region, and just knowing that there's ample precipitation, like water is not a limiting factor. We can increase biomass greatly on the East Coast, but that comes with the caveat that decomposition is also higher especially in the southern US where temperatures are higher. So that plot is maybe a little misleading in that way, but yeah, there's a really high potential rate for inputs of soil carbon in that region. I'll have Keith chime in if he has any other explanation for that.
Yeah, I would agree. It's really driven by, productivity potential. If you're in a subhumid area, if you're kind of in the Midwest, you've got a lot of potential to generate a lot of biomass, a lot of crop residues. You're going to be successful with cover crops. So you're just really increasing the carbon inputs to soil. So if you have soils that are depleted through past practices, then that's going to be an area that you're going to have the highest potential on in terms of per ton per hectare per year, gains. If you're in semi-arid systems like we live out here in eastern Colorado, it's tougher, right? Because you can't fix that much carbon, relatively speaking, in the plant biomass because you don't have enough water. If you're in non-irrigated systems, irrigated systems, of course, are a different story. But that's the biggest thing. I would just mention on the rock weathering. It's really, the idea there is, as Ellie mentioned, is you're adding silicate minerals that are high in base cations. So it's kind of a liming substitute, because if you're adding lime, you're really trying to regenerate your base cations in the soil, right, to bring your pH back up. But if you're adding silicate minerals, so you're not adding, like lime contains carbonates, but you're adding base cations without the carbonates, then those base cations react with CO2 that is in the root zone naturally, and you generate carbonate bicarbonate ions that eventually, so the idea is eventually they make it to the ocean, right? And once they're in the ocean, that is a kind of a permanent storage, right? And so in principle, it works to take CO2 from the atmosphere, and essentially, it sounds kind of crazy, but it's eventually moving that carbonate into the ocean. One of the tricky parts, so it works in principle, but the tricky part is is really some of the accounting. So we don't necessarily know. It's not that easy to sort of count the carbonate bicarbonate ions that leach below the vadose zone and then eventually end up in oceanic storage. And so it has it has some advantages relative to the organic carbon storage, but it's but it's still pretty early days to figure out how economical it is, how practical it is, how well we can actually quantify the effects in terms of carbon removals.
Thank you for that, Keith. I do want to recognize one comment we've got from a former USFRA board member, Rochelle Krusmark, who is a soy farmer in Minnesota. Rochelle, good to see you. She was talking about nitrogen inhibitors, and on her farm it has not been very economical. Waiting to apply nitrogen after the ground temp is below 50 works best. Anybody have any comments about nitrogen inhibitors that they'd like to contribute? No?
I mean, I can add, just because we have a nitrification inhibitor program as part of what we have for the grower. And I think when you look at ways, Dr. Ellis mentioned the different ways in which we can kind of sequester carbon, we're also looking at from a whole on reducing emissions. And nitrogen has a lot of potential because of the CO2 equivalency of nitrogen into a system of both the production of the product and then also how it works on the farm. So for us, the reason why we have a nitrification inhibitor project or program is because of the ability to have evidence and proof of that impact. So what we were just talking about with enhanced rock weathering, again, if you think about the accounting and measuring and modeling and proving is the majority of the battle when it comes to a market system and an accounting system, because we have to, at the end of the day, be able to demonstrate both scientifically and then also with hard evidence, including soil samples and evidence from the field that something actually happened on the farm. So again, some of the challenge with that is practices and inputs are not one size fits all for any operation. Every farmer is going to have their own set of practices that work for them, both from their value system as well as for the economics for their bottom line. However, we're trying to match at least some of those in a programmatic way so that we can kind of do both, help companies meet their greenhouse gas, commitments that they've made, as well as helping to offset some of the costs associated with these practices on the farm. Again, they're not going to work for everybody in every scenario or every system.
Got it. Thank you. As a global company, Dr. Chaubert, I assume, is running carbon markets all over the world. U.S. farmers, U.S. industries, super competitive, always is trying to compare itself to others. How is it going elsewhere around the world compared to how it's going here in the States?
Yeah, so for our business model, North America is our largest region. I will say that we have quite a large emerging market in Asia Pacific, specifically around rice. Again, if we think about CO2 equivalent, methane is very high in an emissions factor. And so rice has a lot higher potential to reduce and that overall reduction from the system. So we do have a pretty big project that's emerging around rice and switching both the agronomics as well as some of the inputs to reduce methane emissions. So that would be our second largest market. We also have programs in South America, Brazil, Argentina, as well as in Europe, pretty much in that order of size and scale.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. Terry, we got a question from Nick Miller. He's asking about the types of tools, information, support that is helpful or required to assist beef producers in the move towards increased, improved grazing practices and utilizing cover crops as a grazing resource, et cetera. Any place you can point, Nick, for more information and what you use that you found helpful?
I work heavily with every state, or at least Wisconsin, has a grazing network, a grazing association. Your county extensions have and your USDA offices and what have you have put a lot of work into grazing and a lot of work into pasture management, and for all types of regions. I would start there. But really, if you want to know the best place to go, is drive around in your area and find someone that has the pasture systems going, has the cattle operation that's working. I don't know of many producers that will not help you. That's the one thing I really love about the cattle industry. We all are competitive. We all know we're competing against each other, but really, we want to help each other. We want to make sure everybody's successful. So, I mean, to me, you got two areas there through USDA, through your state and local organizations, but also pick out a farmer that you think is doing successful, and don't be afraid to reach out to them. I've helped a lot of young farmers in the area get going here, because in the state of Wisconsin, the beef cow herd is the fastest growing herd in the state of Wisconsin. We're up over 10,000 beef producers in the state of Wisconsin now. Granted, they're small herds, anywhere from 20 to 40 cows, but they're still cow herds. They're still using land and converting it back into the types of, maybe got the land that is not the best row crop area, and they're taking back into grass and perennials. So it works. And another thing I want to comment that I talked about earlier, we just had 2.5 inches of rain in a day and a half. And this morning I had to drive to Madison, 25 miles away. And one of the things I look at, you can tell which farmers are using cover crops and no-till and what have you, just by the water absorption. Who's got water ponding on their farms and who doesn't have water pounding, if the land is flat enough to hold the water. And to me, that's one of the biggest advantages I've seen since switching to no-till and implementing the cover crops and going to more alternative forages on the marginal ground, is that my crops stay green longer than a lot of other crops in the area.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific way to end it, because at the end of the day, the goal is to make your operations more resilient, more productive, and ultimately more profitable. And so thank you for those insights. I want to thank Dr. Ellis, Dr. Paustian, Dr. Show, and Terry for everything that you have shared today. I want to promote briefly our next webinar coming up on June the 17th. Terry, if you put that slide up, on Tuesday, June 17th, 2 o'clock to 3:30 Central Time, we're going to dive into the next chapter of the report, focusing on animal protein production and management. And we have another terrific panel lined up for you there. So please plan to join us. Thank you, everyone. Again, we'll be posting recordings of these meetings up on our website, on our YouTube channel, and Vimeo. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, any follow-up questions, would like to get in touch with our speakers. But thank you all for speaking today. Appreciate that, panelists. And then thanks to everyone who attended. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.